Hello, welcome to the podcast How We Build, talks about civil engineering in a different way. My guest today is Professor Anders Buch. For more than 35 years, he's been exploring how work and professional education shape each other in society, how they create experience, expertise, and knowledge. His research covers everything from education and technology to engineering and the sociology of professions. Anders has worked with leading institutions in Denmark and Sweden and is currently professor at VIA University College in Denmark, as well as affiliated with Jönköping University in Sweden. Recently, his work has focused on how digitalization and AI are transforming professional work and education and what that means for engineering today. Hello and welcome.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
Our topic today is discussion about Bildung and how this concept fits in engineering. Uh, I found this really interesting, like a play of words between Bildung and English word building.
It's a German word, Bildung, and it has an origin as also in the German word for an image, ein Bild. So it is kind of an image that you have of a character, so to speak. But at the same time, it also connotes building or bringing forth or shaping. So it's kind of developing character traits in individuals. That was how it was originally framed. But it has a long, long ancestry going back to Greek philosophy, to Plato and Aristotle. They don't use, of course, the German word Bildung, but they use the word paideia. That means cultivating of the whole person, or crafting or shaping a well versed person who were fit to enter the polis, the society, the city society in ancient Greece. So it dates 2,500 years back at least. And you also find similar concepts in different cultures, like in Chinese culture, Japanese culture, Indian Buddhist culture, enlightenment, and so it has a very rich ancestry. We could go more into detail about that if you like, but I think it's important to say that it's not a new invention. It is something that has stayed around for quite a while. But I guess it's new to engineering.
That's what I wanted to say. My understanding is that it is new as a concept in engineering.
Yeah, and traditionally it also has been connoted with the humanities, to be cultivated, to be well versed in literature and philosophy and music and things like that. But it has a much broader scope. It means to there are different ways of interpreting Bildung. So it also means kind of a commitment to society and community, a kind of engagement and having concerns about what is going on in contemporary society, being engaged in that, and kind of participating in worldly activities, so to speak. So it has a lot of relevance for engineers, I think, because engineers, they have a lot of responsibility for what they do. They take very important positions in society, and they are kind of crafting the infrastructures and the technologies that afford all our activities in society. And they share a big responsibility for actually crafting that in responsible and inclusive ways. So if we think about Bildung in that sense, it becomes very, very relevant to engineers nowadays.
where is building taking us, and what is something that we are foreseeing with in introducing building in engineering? And I think when we were talking before, we were mentioning here as well digitalization and AI as the
Mm,
something
mm,
that is happening now and happening fast. And what is
mm.
the applicability for in that area as well?
Yeah, that's an important issue to discuss, and it's for a long while. Education has been very, very important to modern society. It has, and research and education has been the key areas that modern society needs to develop, to thrive, to grow, to it has become kind of the motor of contemporary society. Um, and it's mainly because modern society with technological development needs skilled people to actually for the workforce, and I mean it has become a concept for the OECD, for example, and the economic institution that talks about how societies are growing and developing. So they talk much about competencies. That's a main issue in that regard. And educational institutions and schools, they are measured for how well they actually provide skills and competences for young generations, and that also applies to higher education as such. So what the framework for the OECD is something about that we need skilled people for we need the skills for critical thinking, for creativity, for communication, and for collaboration. And that is of course true, but I think it's kind of something is lacking in that approach, the skills and competencies approach. And that's where Bildung comes into the picture, because it doesn't say much about how we should take care of one another or the environment or the people who who are actually um, become subjects of um, the technology that engineers actually develop. So I think the four C's, critical thinking, creativity, communication, and collaboration, they cannot stand on their own. They need to be supplemented by an extra dimension that care actually can provide, and that Bildung can provide, and that's has something to do with taking care and responsibility and responsiveness, an obligation to convene responsible technologies in society. Issue about building becomes much more pertinent now that we face this AI challenge, because a lot of engineering tasks are being kind of co-opted by AI. I mean, AI are used in different ways, and it's so effective in in many ways. So a lot of engineering tasks can actually be substituted by AI, and I see the development where programmers, they don't need to learn the code maybe from bottom. Bottom up. They can actually use coding, have AI to make the coding. So what they should actually do is kind of assess the AI. So so engineers needs to take that into account, and this schematic way of going through technology and check it at all instances, that has to be revised in a sense, because AI is this black box of AI is actually doing a lot of engineering work for us, for good or worse. But it can be used in that way, and we engineers needs to be very reflective of the output of what is well the proposals of AI, and also to actually be very critical about the algorithms that is being implemented into AI. So that's yet another area where they have to be very aware.
Yes, thank you. That is also my view and my understanding, or at least anticipation, how it will
Mm,
evolve. Because yes, I mean AI tools and those models are becoming more and more advanced every day. I mean,
mm, 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 mm,
we have new models coming out, and I think for, as you said, for things that are like coding and checking compliance with
mm,
standards, with the
mm,
things that are known and deterministic. I think
mm, mm.
that will be something that will be automated in the near
Yeah, yeah.
future. And it's because I think in this certain point we will have capacity or means to check output that AI is giving, and probably rely from that point on the outcomes. But I think the physical part of the story, which is pretty much a great part of especially civil engineering, but also other branches
Mm,
of engineering as an industry will remain, and creativity,
mm.
how
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
to approach something which is multidimensional and multi-sectoral, cross-sectoral. I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that will be
yeah,
something that still will
yeah,
be only like humans and engineers actually can work
yeah.
on and
So
resolve.
so critical thinking and creativity are extremely important, but care has to be taken into consideration as well. So and that's where the building part comes
Yes,
in again. I think that Bildung is a kind of a rejoinder to this efficiency talk that the OECD frameworks actually set up. So we need to think in more broad terms about education and the shaping of character in society.
the OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and it is
And they have been very focused on education and research for a lot of years, going back to post Second World War, thinking about the growth of overseas and economies. OECD and their fixation on growth through creative thinking, creativity, communication, and collaboration, that has a kind of a very sharp focus on growth. But growth needs to be responsible. So it's not enough just to have the economy grow. It needs to grow in the right way, so to speak, because we have obligation towards nature, we have obligation towards well-being in society, and for acting morally in a sense.
when I was researching a little bit about Bildung and as a concept, there is also this aspect of autonomy and personal integrity. What are the, if we can draw a line, what are the commonalities and differences across cultures and practices?
That's a good question, and maybe to answer this, we need to kind of um, focusing on the origins of this notion of Bildung, and for sure it's a European invention going back to ancient Greece. And the way that Europeans think about a lot of things is from the individual's perspective. So individuality and autonomy and the enlightenment of the individual has been kind of a trademark in Western thought for 2,500 years. But we also see now that when the world opened up to other cultures, that there are other conceptions of Bildung. So, for example, in the book, we have a chapter on the notion of Bildung in China, where you see a kind of a Confucian tradition that kind of stress the need to explore Bildung in relation to collective responsibility and being a part of something bigger. That's the general idea about Bildung, being a part of something bigger. But in the European tradition, we have very much stressed the individual part of being a part of society. Whereas maybe in the Asian Chinese tradition, we see a kind of the collective element being stressed very much more than in the European one. There are, of course, also very many diversities in European thinking. So we find one concept in the Francophone tradition, we find another in the Anglophone tradition, we find a third one in the Scandinavian tradition, and so on and so forth. But the big differences we see when we go to Asian cultures, and we see a kind of a different framing of the notion. And that's interesting. And maybe very relevant for us nowadays because uh, when stressing individuality, it becomes very decontextualized. So it's the individual and the individual's rights that are in focus, but we individuals have impacts on society. And when cultures seems to grow and become more interlinked, and we have cultures on a global scale, and we see cultures being mediated by technologies and become more internationalized, I think new questions arise that needs different answers than the individualist framework. So what I'm trying to kind of develop is a new understanding of Bildung that kind of still leans on individual rights, but has a greater focus on the collective dimensions. So I would prefer to talk about not building the individual as such, but building the individual in the relations that the individual has to other individuals and to community as such. So I very much stress the notion of practices. So what are the right engineering practices for the future? So, for example, when an engineer works in a company, there are rules and regulations, but there are also customs about how to go on doing engineering work in a proper and appropriate way. And until recently, efficiency has been the major value of reaching efficiency in relation to technology, but it has to be balanced with the responsibility, I think, because we have reached a phase in the development of technology where technologies have a lot of impact outside the individual sphere. So we need new concepts when we talk about a more collective dimension of praising or evaluating or assessing uh, technologies. So what was the way that we talked about the individual's rights? That was mainly based on a small community, town community, where you had face-to-face interaction with people, and you could actually imagine what are the consequences of my actions. But when when our actions are mediated by technology, they become kind of very immersive and become global suddenly. So when you kind of design a new technology, it could be a program or something, and suddenly it is distributed all over the world. You see a lot of practices being shaped by that technology. And you have to kind of take that into account when developing the program, for example. So what are the consequences? And of course, you cannot predict that in any minute sense, but you should, as an engineer, kind of um, have a modesty or kind of hesitate to or contemplate what are the consequences, and how can we develop more responsible technologies? I'm not making an argument for the perfect world that the engineers should take responsibility for everything. They can't, but they should try to kind of think about the impact of technology in different contexts, different cultural context, different environmental context, and um, kind of contemplate what are the effects and the consequences of the technology. Very mundane example is actually to work with user experiences in designing technologies. So that has been implemented in engineering education, some places, but it has to be much more um, uh, thoroughly integrated into engineering education as a basic way of proceeding.
When you say user experience, I somehow connect that with software development and
Yeah.
digital
But it
tools.
all, yeah, but it also applies to the design of other technologies, so mundane technologies, traffic, for example, or wherever you see technologies. So how do people actually use the technology? Very often, users don't go about the technology as the designers were predicting. So they need to test the technology in relation to the users, and there should be kind of an awareness that you can use technologies in many ways, and you can also misuse or make inappropriate uses of technology. And how can we actually prevent that?
To make a parallel here with built environment, it's also, I mean, I can see this link with user experience, which I believe colleagues, architects that are dealing more with um,
Hmm,
uh, making the concepts of space and the use of space versus
hmm,
civil engineers who are doing actually then building
hmm.
the
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I think this view of user experience applies to all in the project life cycle, whatever that is it technology, is it
yeah.
building, is it new infrastructure, whatever it is, that
Hmm,
actually the value for the users at the end,
yeah, yeah.
it's part of the responsibilities of everyone involved.
Yes, because technologies are often in a material format that channels activities and might obstruct practices, but they might also afford practices. So the designer needs to have that in mind when designing the technology and actually test it out and draw on experiences from society. So that is why the engineer should not be a technology problem solver. Yes, they should be that as well, but they should be a socio-technical problem solver. So the social element and the technological element are very much interlinked or integrated in the design process.
If we talk about what future might look like, so the question is, what might the engineer, or I put in parentheses civil engineer,
Yeah.
could look like 10 years from now?
And I think that's an important, and we have to answer that question all the time. But we also need a bit of caution here because it's very often the question is answered with a lot of hype, so and wishful thinking. But ideally, of course, the engineer should become be able to work fluently with AI and digitalization, digitalized tools, but still remain accountable and ethical, responsible for the decisions that they make. They should be able to operate in interdisciplinary teams and learn as they do their work. and take from various disciplines and areas of expertise important knowledge. They should actually be able to bridge knowledge that being produced in engineering with the social sciences and the humanities as well. They should be attuned to sustainability, resilience, and care in communities, and be very open-minded and very attentive to local needs when designing technologies. They should not just solve problems, but also think about how the problems are framed. So they should be very accountable in relation to are we actually solving the right problems? So it's a kind of are we just producing technological fixes that do not have an impact in real life? Because to have an impact, you also need to be aware of how technology interact with the social domain. So they should be attentive to that. So that's the ideal picture that we should strive for. But I know it's difficult, of course, and there are a lot of things. The world is not ideal, and there are a lot of hurdles that engineers meet, both when in education, but also through their day-to-day work in companies and in society. So as we should be very aware of that. But we shouldn't kind of retreat because of those hurdles and become defeatistic in the sense that, well, okay, things are so difficult, and I'm just a pure, I'm just an engineer, so I cannot make an impact here. And that's what Bildung is actually about: making individuals aware that they are part of something bigger. They're part of an engineering profession. They're part of a collective, a way of thinking, and if we could actually try to make this way of thinking more responsive and more responsible to some of the actual problems that we face nowadays, I think, and that's what I mean by transcending the individual perspective and taking a more collective perspective and a more practice-oriented perspective on Bildung.
How does this concept apply to the everyday work of engineers or civil engineers?
And it's of course problematic because of course there are all those challenges that I mentioned, that there's a lot of knowledge in the world. If you and you cannot have it all in your head at once. And for sure, for 4 or 5 years training as an engineer, being educated as an engineer, you cannot absorb all the knowledge you need. So there is, and technology becomes more and more specialized, and the sciences become more and more specialized. So you need to do a lot of reading and a lot of learning and a lot of work to become a competent engineer in your small subfield. But you have to have this awareness that you are only a cog in the wheel, so to speak. That you only take that your contribution is not what is actually framing the big picture of establishing sustainable and responsible new practices. But you have to have awareness about what your contribution amounts to, and seeing how it can actually fit in with other what you know are real problems out there. So is my engineering faculties being used in responsible ways? Do they actually contribute to solutions that might benefit others than just the owners of the company for obtaining a bigger profit? That's fine, of course. This should not be done on a basis that might at some point harm other parts of community.
What current engineering education or civil engineering education, if we can put some reflections there, and if Bildung should be taught at universities and why.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I definitely think that Bildung should be taught at universities and engineering schools or wherever engineering is taught. But I think we have started on the wrong foot with this of thinking about how Bildung should actually be implemented in engineering, because very often it is kind of okay, yeah, we need an ethics course. So we just have a singular module in a big technical engineering education, and then you have a ethics course where you are introduced to a lot of philosophers, Bentham, Kant, Aristotle, and all the ethical theories, and then you're kind of left on your own to make translate that knowledge into engineering, and that's not a way to do it. Bildung should not be taught as um, single standing courses. It should be integrated in the actual engineering being done and being taught. When you think about design or have design classes, you should kind of talk about having an awareness of, okay, is this design helpful? Who is it helpful for? Is it inclusive for minorities, for example, for disabled people? Or is it, have those kind of considerations where you're not just focusing on a very, very narrow objective of having a quick fix for technological development, but instead kind of contextualizing it to a contemporary society, to the contemporary society needs. This is, of course, also uh, much more easy to say than to do it, because it needs to kind of a rethinking of the engineering curriculum, and also a kind of different pedagogy to teach engineering.
I found somewhere information that the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, KTH, is actually looking into implementing or integrating Bildung in in their education or their system. But I don't know if that happened and if they actually did it. So yes, do you know for some examples maybe from the education where the engineering courses are restructured or changed to bring this higher level concepts in a classroom?
Yeah, yeah. It's not that much linked to the actual phrasing of Bildung, but for example, when I was a professor at Aalborg University, I taught an interdisciplinary program of techno-anthropology. That was a program that kind of integrated the social sciences with engineering, and developed technology, the understanding of technologies through their actual use in society. So it was based on problem-based learning. So the students were actually being incentivized to find some technologies that were actually used in society and try to explore how that technology was actually being used or misused, or if that technology was appropriate or inappropriate or lived up to the standards that the users preferred, and to actually critically assess how that technology has been developed throughout history, and how it's could be kind of reconfigured to contemporary needs. Um, so that was a kind of a tweaking of the engineering approach to become more relevant for contemporary problems, and also to broaden it. So it was not kind of only a technological education, but an education about technology in use, so to speak.
Yes, thank you. That is really interesting example. I'm, I mean, as we speak, I'm just thinking about and myself being a civil engineer. That, for example, for everyday work of a civil engineer on the construction site, it might look a little bit distant from that kind of job or work. I mean, and this is
Mm,
example,
mm,
but
mm,
we
mm.
can see other examples as well. For example, when someone is working under tight deadlines and in the
Yeah,
design,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I mean, everyone
yeah,
I really like trying to do their best and implementing all technical knowledge they have, being aware of all the codes and the standards and making sure that
yeah, 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 yeah.
everything is implemented. How we can maybe link this concept with with someone's reality? How we can
Yeah,
bridge
yeah.
maybe that?
Yeah, exactly. And you're quite right in mentioning those obstacles, for they are big obstacles, and they have to do with in, this instrumental focus and this efficiency focus that you need to be to produce faster and less expensive, and to have products that are good for everyone, and not for particular groups of people, because it's easier to sell products that are can be universally applied, instead of people, or technologies that are more tailored to specific needs. So there are real problems that you outlined there, and they're important. But I think to change that, that can be done in different ways. It can be done through legislation about technology, about what kind of technologies are actually should be developed, and how the standards of the technologies. That's one way. That's you see that in the EU, for example, about the digital technologies, and there's a lot of talk about that. But if we just focus on education, I mean, an educational process is also a process of socialization, how to become a competent engineer and do what competent engineers do, and to change the image of what is the competent engineer. If that has not done, if that's not entirely focused on efficiency, productivity, and things like that, but also on social accountability, responsibility, inclusiveness, and those ideals, you might, on the long run, change things. It's not a quick fix that we're talking about here. It's not just a one course. It's a kind of changing the minds of the students. So they try to kind of frame their developmental work, their everyday work with technologies to become more responsive and responsible. It might seem idealists, and it is, but it's also so important, I think, because we see a lot of issues now with sustainability issues, about pollution, and about climate change and things like that. So you need to have this holistic mindset to so for every step you take in a technological development process, you have to question yourself and your peers and the development team. Are we are we are we accountable now? And whom are we accountable to? Is it the stakeholders of the company? Is it the users of the technology? Is it disabled groups in society? Is it minorities and things like that? So that kind of reflection needs to take place. And if you can reflect on that level, I think you have become a cultivated engineer, so to speak.
Yeah,
But I think the burden should not be put on the individual engineer alone to be reflexive and accountable. It should also be in the kind of being rooted in the procedures that they work by. And this, having the procedures being accountable, that starts when you learn how to do engineering. So there you learn what are the appropriate processes we go through in a development phase of a project, for example. What should we check with the users, for example, or is that just something that they do in another department in the company? So, but you have to have that mindset.
Probably role of the industry in shaping next generations as well.
Yeah, and allowing for those procedures to actually be implemented in their routines and procedures.
If we can maybe just go to a closing reflection, it would be really great to hear how to complete the sentence, how we build.
I actually have three proposals to your question here. So one goes like this: how to build reflect who we are and shapes who we may become. And another way to go with it is how we build today prefigure the world our children will inhabit. And a third proposal is how we build is never just technical. It is always cultural, ethical, and political
Oh,
at the
nice.
same time. So
Thank you. Yes.
that, I think that very nicely sums up at least what my message has been throughout our conversation, that we need to broaden our mindset of engineering in relation to social, societal, ethical, responsible practices.
Thank you for listening. I invite you to share your views, suggest topics, and recommend guests. And now, over to you.